Let me, like any good millennial, remove the nicotine from my mouth.
Oh my gosh, that's the most like Republican coded thing I've ever seen you do.
Well, I took your quiz, and do you want to guess what I got? Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk, and today we are talking about the youth. And when I say youth, I am being generous with myself. What I really mean is millennials, a group that today stretches from the sprightly age of 30 to the ripe old age of 45. We're also going to talk a bit about Gen Z, but that's a group that still hasn't come into its own politically and economically. The youngest Gen Zers are still 5 years away from the voting booth. But millennials are here. They run the largest AI companies in the world, they sit in seats of power from Congress to the vice presidency, and they're increasingly reshaping American politics in their image. If you followed Democrats' mini summer of discontent, you've noticed that, at least within the Democratic Party, they're much more progressive than their elders and likelier to back insurgent candidates who pitch wholesale change. Though it's a group that leans left, the young right is also different. They've ditched Fox for podcasters, care more about cancel culture than traditional values on same-sex marriage or abortion, and share a skepticism of the status quo with their left counterparts. In talking about the youth, or let's say the younger half of the country, after all, the median American is 40 years old, we're going to try to get a better sense of this moment in politics and where we're headed. And we'll dive into the new political tribes that describe our divisions. Here with me to do that is Kristen Soltis Anderson, Republican pollster and co-founder of Echelon Insights. She also writes the newsletter Type A- and is the author of the book Selfie Vote, Where Millennials Are Leading America and How Republicans Can Keep Up. So Kristen, welcome back to the podcast. It's great to have you.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm excited. So where are millennials leading America? No, I won't leave that question that open-ended. You wrote the Selfie Vote a little over a decade ago, and the argument then was that millennials weren't just going to age into conservatism, and their social cultural perceptions and preferences, tastes, would keep them on the left side of the political spectrum into adulthood. How is that thesis holding up in this moment?
I think it's holding up pretty well. There was a little bit of a moment after the 2024 election when Donald Trump did pretty well among younger voters, better than any real Republican had among young voters since George W. Bush. And it was a moment of like, you know what? Maybe it is that Democrats sort of squandered their opportunity. But we've very quickly seen everything kind of snap back into position where for millennials, it is not the case that they are just economically conservative at heart, but they were socially progressive on a couple of issues. And that was their big divide with the GOP. They were people who were coming of age in the wake of the global financial crisis of 2008. And that shaped their worldview. It shaped their beliefs about government. It shaped their beliefs about the economy. It shaped their beliefs about capitalism. And you come out of that into the sort of Bernie Sanders moment. You have a generation that doesn't really think about socialism in a kind of Cold War capitalism versus socialism type context, and you wind up where we are today. In fact, there's a great piece Jay Caspian Kang wrote at the New Yorker about what he calls Subaru socialists, which he sort of describes as these like millennial college grads. They lived through 2008. That they are the future of the Democratic Party, and they sure are. That's really where I saw a lot of this headed. And even if it's the case that people who were born in the 80s today might vote a little more Republican than they did during the Obama heyday, their baseline is still so much further to the left than Gen X's ever was, than the Boomers ever was. And it is now creating a dynamic where Republicans dismissed it for a while because, they're only, 12% of the electorate in a midterm, who kind of cares? Okay, we won't win college towns, boo-hoo. Now it's becoming a real thing. Now millennials are buying homes, they're moving to the suburbs. They may be doing it on a delayed timeline relative to when their parents did, but now suddenly we are running big institutions. We have an enormous amount of economic power. There's a reason we're being pandered to by the culture these days with all the 90s nostalgia. And that is also showing up in political power too.
Yeah, so just as a benchmark, I want to read the exit polls from 2024. 30 to 44-year-olds went for Harris by just 4 points. 18 to 29-year-olds went for Harris by 11 points. And that's that moment that you're talking about where it becomes uncertain if all of the advantages that the Democratic Party had with young voters would stick. How have things evolved since then? Less than 2 years later, what does the young vote look like in terms of its political preferences? And I want to say here, that's obviously the two-party vote. What we're also seeing is just a dramatic increase in independent identification.
Yes. So it is not the case that the Democratic Party has captured the imagination of the young voter, especially for Gen Z, who came of age during the kind of COVID era. For them, they very much have an attitude of like, if you call for help, no one is coming. Like the institutions, the parties, the infrastructures, like none of that is set up to help you or make your life better. And so you began to hear rumblings of this back a couple of years ago, but that like college Republican and college Democrat chapters were struggling to get membership, but more issue-oriented groups, you know, on the right, like Turning Point, or on the left, Climate Action, Free Palestine, all of those sorts of things, you just began to see more of the energy be around issues rather than like, gosh, let's go out and knock doors for Sherrod Brown. And that change, I think, is part of why Republicans felt pretty enthusiastic looking at those exit polls. They said, oh my gosh, what do you mean the millennials were going to be Democrats forever? Look, that age group that is mostly millennials voted for Harris by only 4 points. Like we're fine. We're fine. There's nothing to worry about. But what was happening under the surface was that those voters were generally not becoming conservative, not really at all on economic issues. There were some things like immigration where there was a big backlash to what people perceived as a pretty open border. There was a little bit of frustration around things like crime and policing, but in general, younger voters did not become like rabid capitalists in that time. Instead, Donald Trump just assembled a coalition that did not require you to be a traditional capitalist whatsoever to still be part of the Republican family. So now what you're looking at in the data is Dan Cox at AEI. He just put out a really interesting look at Gen Z voters broken out by gender and how in the last 2 years, two things have happened. One is that young men in Gen Z had actually been moving more and more conservative, but that kind of peaks in 2024 and begins to like subside, plateau, taper off just a little bit. While at the same time, Gen Z young women make a hard left turn in the last 2 years. And so the gender gap among Gen Z is quite enormous, but it's driven less by, you know, we hear so much talk about like, oh, what's happening to the young men? Are they all out there listening to Tucker Carlson? Like, do they need to be saved from the far right? And the answer is that for young men, they're just more politically neutral. It's actually young women who have shifted very progressive in the last couple of years. And that has sort of pulled the baseline for whether it's your Democratic primary electorate or just the whole political environment's moved with that.
I'm curious here how much of the caricatures of millennials have held up. You know, it was kind of a long time ago at this point, but I remember being accused of spending all of my savings on avocado toast, and therefore I would never be able to buy a home. And I guess a weird relationship with work because we were at once both accused of like wanting to have it all at work, but also accused of being kind of lazy. I'm not sure which one it really was. But now in 2026, the vice president is a millennial. Sam Altman is just as much of a millennial as AOC or Daria Lisa Avila Chevalier. And so like any generation, we have all different kinds of members, but you've also tracked tastes and culture alongside politics. Like, how have we evolved in the workplace, in our tastes and so on beyond politics?
So there's a very fun back-to-back pair of New York Times headlines that I love to show people when I'm explaining the evolution of all of this, which is sometime in like the mid-2010s, there was a headline saying like, what happens when millennials enter the workplace? And it was a story that the lead of the story is about a young man who tells his boss that his friend has died and he needs to take some days off to go to the funeral and mourn and, you know. And then this guy instead like builds himself a treehouse in his backyard and And then in the true millennial fashion, like Instagrams himself doing it and therefore gets like busted. And this is intended to portray like, look at these millennials. They're all kind of lying to look out for themselves. They're lazy and they're narcissists too. And they just they care about their own little passion projects instead of like doing a good job at work. And then you fast forward 10 years and the Times then has a piece that's like, millennials are afraid of the Gen Zers who work for them. And it was a story about how millennials are now like looking aghast at these Gen Zers who like show up at their work in their pajamas or like are offended at the idea that you would ever have to go to an office. And so there's some level of this at which I think is just like everybody complains about young people and says that they're lazy. But the one thing that I do think was a stereotype about millennials that was borne out in the data and kind of remains true is that for millennials, they didn't just view a job as a paycheck. It was that you wanted to do something that you found personally fulfilling. You wanted to do something that was maybe mission driven. You wanted to see some kind of an impact in the world.
Host a podcast, maybe.
Host a
I'm
podcast,
just spitballing here.
Which doesn't mean that everyone was going to go get a job at a nonprofit, but it does mean that if you think of a past generation as like, I'm going to put my head down, I'm going to do my job, I'm going to collect my paycheck, I'm going to go home to support my family and my work life and my personal life, like ne'er shall the two meet, that for millennials, they were kind of breaking down those walls a little bit more. They wanted to show off more of their personality at work, and what they did for their job meant a little bit more to their identity. For Gen Z, the big difference there is that for them, many more of them are not interested in like their job being their identity. They want to clock out at 5 and not think about it anymore. And you can argue whether like which one is the healthier approach. But this is why I named my Substack Type A-, because I think if you had to describe like the millennial ethos, or at least among like millennials who are, working and trying to like move up the career ladder, it's this like pragmatism is good. Things aren't great right now, but we believe that if we work hard enough, maybe they'll be better in the future and we'll eventually get there. And Gen Z doesn't really share some of those sensibilities. They're much less incrementalist. They're much more, let's just burn it all down. They're much less optimistic that eventually things will be okay. They're like, no, everything kind of sucks and it probably always will suck. And I think there are some things about the information environment in which we were sort of cooked as 20-somethings that tells us a little bit about why that's the case. But everybody says young people are lazy. So I'm not here to cast aspersions on Gen Z and say they're lazy, but I do think that they have a different view of the intersection between their identity and their work than millennials, who are more likely to view what they do for their job as like a part of who they are.
There's also something interesting that happens in looking at exactly this data, right? Like, you don't have to speculate about Gen Z's work ethic. You can ask them, like, would you be willing to work overtime if it meant making more money? How would you prioritize different aspects of your life? And you see that Gen Z is, for example, less willing to work overtime than past younger generations. But you see it really crater around COVID. And so I'm curious, like, millennials were forged in the fires of, the Great Recession and Occupy Wall Street, and then had all of the Obama-based optimism and that jazz. Gen Z's pivotal historical moment so far was the pandemic. How has that shaped their politics differently?
I want to give some credit to Rachel Janfaza, who writes at The Up and Up and has looked at this. And she really thinks that COVID sort of bisects Gen Z, that if you are a Gen Zer who was kind of already out in the world, had already started your career, like you had already started to get on your own 2 feet when COVID happened, that it's fundamentally different than when you were still either living with your parents or maybe in college in a setting where you were looking for adults to take care of you, and then maybe came to the conclusion that like actually help is not on the way. That in fact, I've gotten screwed by the bad decisions of institutions that my parents or grandparents, they all trusted, and instead it was like a total mess. And I didn't get to go to my prom, and I didn't get to go to my graduation, and I spent my college years on Zoom, and that all feels really, really cruddy to me. And now I'm out in the world trying to learn how to date, how to make friends, how to do all these things, because I got so screwed at these absolutely crucial years of my life. So there was some talk that like for the Gen Zers who were the most negatively impacted by COVID, that there was, especially among those young men, more of that kind of rightward drift. But I'm unsure in thinking about that Dan Cox data that I was just looking at. I actually don't know how that breaks out Gen Z men pre and post COVID. Like, where were you if you'd see a difference there? But that's a really interesting research question.
I want to maybe apply some of this to the moment that we're in. We're in the middle of this, as I described it, a mini summer of discontent. Abdul al-Sayed ultimately won the Democratic primary in Michigan by less than expected, but still a pretty significant win for the progressive part of the Democratic Party, and very clearly boosted by these younger voters that we're talking about. I mean, there were parts of college towns, for example, in Ann Arbor, where there were some precincts where I don't think a single vote went to Haley Stevens, for example.
Yeah.
How does what you're describing here come together to create those kinds of political outcomes?
I think it's fascinating because Haley Stevens and Abdul al-Sayed, I believe, are like a year apart. They're both millennials. They're both like 1983, 1984 babies. Shout out, the best time to have been born. So
hey, it's 1990, clearly. Come on.
What's fascinating to me about this is that like you can look at a race like this with two candidates who are almost exactly the same age. They're both millennial candidates. And I feel like they both represented different strains of the millennial political approach in a super interesting way. And only one of which is appealing to Gen Z. And I think that's why you see the Gen Z behaving quite differently. For Haley Stevens, it's the kind of like Obama-ish, let's be positive, we can let's work hard and make change, Leslie Knope.
A little bit of stick it to him, if you will.
A little bit of stick it to him, that like there is a strain of that kind of optimism. Gosh, if we put our heads down, we can do it. There is some of that in the millennial cringe category, I guess, that's like totally foreign to Gen Z. At the same time, Abdul al-Sayed has the I don't trust the systems that are around us. The economy is rigged. We were all promised a future that's not available to us. We were told that we were lazy and that we were spending too much on avocado toast, and that's why we're not going to get homes. But actually, the reason we're not going to get homes is private equity. Let's go fight that fight. And that is also something that you could see the seeds of millennials believing and feeling strongly about 10 years ago that still persists today and is sort of where Gen Z is picking up. And so it's like there are these different strains of kind of millennial democratic thought, one of which is sort of being crushed while the other one is becoming ascendant because it's drawing in new allies from the young Gen Z Democrats coming behind them.
Would you compare this moment for Democrats to what the Tea Party was for Republicans and the rise of Trump?
Yes. And when I do this, I find that Democrats I talk to, they kind of recoil in horror. They're like, ooh, the Tea Party was so gross. We're not doing that. That's not what it is. And what I always try to say is, I actually think that the Tea Party was not a pure net negative for the Republican Party. In 2010, the Tea Party came in and said, arose as a movement. And in some cases, you got Christine O'Donnell and Sharon Engel and Ken Buck. And you had seats that Republicans could have won in a really good year that got thrown away because the Tea Party nominated a candidate that was not in the mainstream. But the Tea Party also is the reason why Marco Rubio is in the Senate. Because at that point, I don't feel like people remember this, but the NRSC endorsed then Republican governor of Florida, Charlie Crist, for that Senate seat. And Republican voters in Florida were like, you are not going to stick us with this guy as our nominee. We like Marco. He's our guy. We're going to go with him. And so not all of the cases where the establishment candidate got the boot was necessarily a bad thing. They weren't all disasters. They weren't all fringy. So sometimes having a movement within your party that says to shake things up and stop being so sclerotic and forces people in the party to have to earn their voters' vote instead of just being on autopilot, I think that can be a good thing. The thing that I think has let Democrats not experience this for so long is that in both cases, the older voters, and there's a generational divide, and who turns out in primaries that I think staved this off for Democrats for a little while. So for Republicans, their base and their activist class have long been somewhat the same. When we look at our political tribes and we look at the loyal right, the most conservative voters we have, they tend to be a much larger share of the primary electorate than other pieces of the Republican coalition. So when you go in a primary, you have to win those people in order to win. On the Democratic side, like the far left, for a while was not the lion's share of Democratic primary voters. That's how you wind up with Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee in 2020. That's how you wind up with Hillary Clinton as the Democratic nominee in 2016. It's why the Bernie thing never actually fully got liftoff, because the median Democratic primary voter was older and more moderate. But as millennials get older and become a bigger and bigger share of Democrats' voter base, and as they become more reliable voters, they're bringing their politics with them. They're bringing their skepticism of capitalism. They're bringing their more progressive social views. And it's putting the Democratic Party in a bind where they, for a long time, had staved off the insurgency. Republicans' insurgency was driven by older Republicans who just had really conservative views and were sick of their own party. On the Democratic side, it really started with younger people, and that's why it's been bubbling. Young people vote for Bernie, but then he doesn't win. And then they vote for Bernie again, and then he doesn't win. And occasionally you get a win in an AOC, but it's in a blue district. And so this is like the first time where it's actually starting to happen at a bigger scale as millennials enter their 40s and become much more reliable voters than they were in their 20s, but still have those same political ideals. It's starting to have more of a real impact. Now, I don't think that one very closely contested Senate race in Michigan is dispositive of like, oh, the Democrats' Tea Party has happened. But the Tea Party also wasn't just the 2010 election for Republicans. That was the first place where it really started to make a difference. But 2012, you had this sort of bubbling in the background, and then Mitt Romney gets picked, but then he loses, and there's this huge Republican civil war over, look, we gave the establishment their candidate again, and he blew it. I'm sick of giving them their candidates. That eventually leads to Donald Trump. And so for Democrats, I don't think it's that like this is their Tea Party year and it's just something that's going to be confined to this year. I think it's that they are now experiencing an ideological insurgency. But that's not just about ideology. It's also about a combativeness and a frustration with a staleness. And that's going to be something that their establishment's going to have to grapple with in the same way that John Boehner and folks of yore had to deal with on the right.
There are plenty of podcasts out there ready to tell you exactly what to think about politics. This is not one of them. GD Politics is a place to test assumptions, sit with uncertainty, and let the evidence lead, even when it complicates the story. I want politically inclined people of all kinds to find something valuable here, and paid subscribers make that possible. You'll get twice as many episodes, plus access to the subscriber chat where you can send me your questions. If curiosity and rigor are what you want from political media, become a paid subscriber at gdpolitics.com. We'd be so grateful to have you. There was a sense, I believe, within the Democratic Party that because the ideological revolution happened first in the Republican Party and pushed moderates towards the Democratic Party as a result in, the 2018 election and 2020, we saw Joe Biden, even in 2020, picking up some more ancestrally Republican voters. Even Kamala Harris tried to campaign with the former Republican class, etc. There was a sense that because this more suburban moderate voter had shifted to the Democratic Party, that would be a stabilizing force. What happens to those voters now? I mean, do they continue to be a more stabilizing? There's this sense that, there's this college-educated suburban voter who has relatively moderate tastes, and that combined with maybe, Black voters who are the most conservative Democratic voters stabilizes the Democratic Party. Is that not the case?
Well, those college-educated, more upscale Democrats they are much more likely to vote for a candidate of the far left than they were in the past. I think they've sort of gotten beyond the idea that like, ooh, that's icky, I'm not going to do that. Give me my normal centrist moderate, that they're now much more willing to be like, you know what, maybe we should just have Medicare for all. And that it is actually that like voters of color, working class. Like if you look at the contours of the Michigan race, it was young voters and it was like white affluent Democrats who were the ones who voted for Abdul al-Sayed, where I think normally the thought would be that the white affluent Democrats would have been like Haley Stevens voters. And like the politics of this have been a little bit more scrambled to where the faction of the party that claims to speak for the working class is not yet at the ballot box dominating with the working class, with the exception of like college educated, but maybe, not as economically upwardly mobile type folks, there's just this divide between like, are actual Democratic working class voters truly being listened to or not?
Let's touch that stove. So you made reference to the downwardly mobile urban left. I think you called them earlier in the podcast super socialists, which is what Jay Caspian King calls them in his New Yorker piece. But here we're essentially talking about folks with a college degree who don't make all that much money, who are the most inclined to vote for the more progressive or socialist candidates. My, former boss, Nate Silver, wrote about this recently, where he looked at income level and educational attainment and found that the people who are most likely to be socialist inclined or most progressive are folks with post-grad degrees who make between $30,000 and $60,000 a year. Now, to be clear, this is not a very large portion of the electorate. Most people with that much education make more money than that. But people who do have a college degree, who may be, we've talked about this on the podcast a little bit before, freelance graphic designer, a teacher, maybe they're millennials who feel like they were promised a whole lot more. And even on a salary, the median American salary of, say, $65,000 a year, aren't able to afford childcare, a house, things like that. Is that part of the electorate where this is all coming from?
There's a book this is like an ancient text now, but it's David Brooks. You may recall Bobos in Paradise. This was a book that he wrote about like what he called bourgeois bohemians. And like, again, I think this book is at least 20 years old at this point. But it was like a sociological look at these like folks who were very educated, working in creative fields, influential fields. And there's a chapter where he talks about the way that people who like work in academia or nonprofits or are political staffers, which is not a terribly high, it's you're doing fine if you're working in DC, working as a political staffer, but you're not making like gazillions of dollars. You are not like in the capital class. And so he has a whole chapter about how like this resentment can build up because you are constantly hanging out with or are exposed to people who have the same or less education than you, but they're doing economically much better. They are living a lifestyle that's just so different than what you are. Like they're not worried about, what kind of groceries are they going to buy? And like a resentment starts to build up. Wait a minute. I'm a smart person. I worked really hard. I got a degree. I did everything right. And yet I'm still the one that like, I can't go on a fancy vacation 3 times a year. And yet I see all these people around me who are. And I wonder if that's a piece of it. It's like a sense that the system is broken that is amplified by the fact that as a college-educated person in one of these professions, you're probably around or exposed to people or you see them on social media all the time where you're like, I have more degrees than that person, but they seem to be living a pretty fancy life. Like, what's actually going on here? And I can't help but think that that's some of what is shaping views. I feel like Megan McArdle talks about this a little bit as like the kind of the affluenza problem that like you get a misperception of what your economic standing ought to be by seeing it in other people. You're frankly seeing some of this bubble up in Burrito Gate on the right. This online fight between Vice President J.D. Vance and his Turning Point USA allies versus commentator Mark Thiessen over like whether burritos are in fact expensive or not, and whether people, are the kids complaining today too much that burritos are expensive? Like, I just think there's, for a lot of young people who are sort of told, do X, Y, and Z and it will all work out for you, their standard of living might be, by objective standards, better than that of their grandparents when their grandparents were 22, but they don't feel like it because they look around them and they see other people doing really well, or the system working for some people but not others, and they think this is unfair, this is garbage, let's throw it all out.
I want to quote the article that we've mentioned by Jay Caspian King in The New Yorker that reads, "Many skeptics see a contradiction in high-achieving, mostly white young voters employing rhetoric about labor and solidarity. Every big election night for the leftists comes with the same eye-rolling complaint from centrists and the right. Oh, great, some gentrifiers who went to Sarah Lawrence are cosplaying socialism and pretending they're working class. But all voting blocs come with some supposed contradictions. Poor, non-college educated voters regularly prefer candidates who support tax cuts for billionaires, for example. What this usually means is that the apparent contradiction isn't particularly relevant for these voters or very revealing about their preferences. And a whole lot of people under the age of 45 no longer believe that indicators such as wages, unemployment, or the number of college degrees that are handed out in a given year have much to do with a healthy economy. They are concerned with the consolidation of wealth, the price of housing, the cost of childcare, and student debt. And absent an upheaval of the entire political establishment in this country, they don't really see why anything would get better, even if they might admit that things are not so bad for them personally right now. I feel like that really captures a lot of what we're talking about. And I'm curious where that leads politics next.
So I am concerned about where I'm generally an optimistic person, but I am a little bit concerned because I think that there is people always talk about the things are fine for me, but they're terrible everywhere else. You know, my congressman is fine, but Congress is bad.
70% of Americans say their personal economic situation, literally this is the data, 70% of Americans say their personal economic situation is good, but 20%, 30% say that the economic situation in the country is good.
Right. And I think part of what is driving this is the information ecosystem that we are all in, particularly young people, is we're getting information about the way the world works online. And what do these algorithms prioritize? They prioritize things that make us feel, and particularly things that make us feel angry. There's enormous amounts of research on the fact that these algorithms are more likely to prioritize putting something into your feed that's going to piss you off than something that's going to make you happy if it's about, politics, et cetera. And so that's how you and that's not to say that it's all wrong. It's just the world in which you live. Every time you open your phone, you're seeing something that's by the way, did you know that data centers use 800,000 gazillion gallons of water and they're coming to your neighborhood and you're not going to be able to take a shower? And oh, by the way, did you know that no houses in your neighborhood are available because they've all been brought up by private equity and so on and so forth? And it's you can see it just hitting the rage button on people all the time. Oh my God, this is what's happening. And even if you know that at some level, some of it's not true, some of it's nonsense, some of it's AI slop, whatever, at some level, it's giving you an explanation for why things just it's making you feel crappy, and it's giving you an explanation for why things feel crappy. That's not to say it's all in people's heads, but it's that the ratio of good news to bad, or the ratio of things that are there to incite versus inform, is just off in a way that I think is making everyone feel worse about everything all the time. This is trying to explain kind of the vibe session problem, right? Which is not just about Trump, but everybody says things are bad, even when the economic data say it's good. And I think some of that is the information we get that just reminds us more often than people used to get reminded. Hey, actually, did you know things are terrible out there in the world? And I think that's part of what's making people feel constantly dissatisfied. It's why every election constantly feels like a swing election. If you're just always feeling more negative about things, you're always going to want to say, well, this sucks. Let's try something different.
And that seems to be in some ways a uniting through line between the young left and the young right. I think in a 2025 Harvard Youth poll, only 13% of young Americans said the country was headed in the right direction. Increasingly, socialists are winning in urban areas. And I've spent plenty of time on this podcast on its forebearer asking Democrats or democratically aligned folks how they're going to win working class and rural voters and improve their lot in parts of the country that they've lost. How do Republicans win in cities or more solidly blue areas? Because it seems like at a time like this, if there's going to be an opening to win areas that haven't traditionally been easy for Republicans, it would be when Democrats are doing something a little more radical. A Republican can sneak in there and do something quite normie or moderate and pull over some voters. But we see that time and time again, there's just not Republicans don't stand up real candidates in the bluer parts of the country. Maybe the answer is they don't need to, so it doesn't matter. But is there a movement within the Republican Party to try to win those places back? And I do say back, New York had a Republican mayor when I lived there.
I would recommend everybody who listens to your podcast to go read the profile of Reihan Salam and the Manhattan Institute and what he is trying to do to be a counterweight in Mamdani's New York. Reihan has been on this beat forever. He is phenomenal. And I think he's very savvy because he's not out there trying to wear like the I am a capital C conservative. It's much more about pragmatism and how do we do what we know works and what is time tested. And I actually think a lot about Glenn Youngkin, who again he was not running for mayor of a city, but had to win in a pretty blue state in what was not necessarily guaranteed to be the easiest political environment, and pulled it off by not just running up big margins in the red areas, but by flipping some of the places that had these like more, the suburbs or the perpetual swing turf and doing well there. I think Republicans like winning the Chicago mayor's race is not something that you're going to go see me like put down a bet on a prediction market for anytime soon, although you could probably get it for pretty cheap. But I do think that like pulling off victories in maybe more of like mid-size cities, the sorts of places where good governance is still possible and opportunity is still possible, and people haven't been totally priced out of living there, is where if I was designing a movement to do this, I would start.
We've talked plenty about the Democratic side of the ledger because young voters, as you wrote about a decade ago, are quite left in their political preferences. But a lot of them, there are plenty also on the right. So I'm curious, how are millennials and Gen Z reshaping the Republican Party?
Gen Z is reshaping the Republican Party in part because there is, in the wake of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, this was a moment that was like very shocking, very heartbreaking, very unifying for Republicans of all generations, of this feeling of, we're under siege, we all need to band together. I think the power of that movement that was ostensibly built around young people, but clearly had resonance with older Republicans, for the way that the young right, I think, is shaping the GOP is that there is less of an adherence to sort of old school free market orthodoxy. Again, for the millennial Republicans, the global financial crisis, they remember it. For Gen Z, COVID, they remember it. And so they are a little bit more skeptical of institutions. They are a little bit more skeptical of markets, and in that sense, have something in common with folks on the young left. The other huge difference between younger and older Republicans and the way they are shaping the party is on foreign policy. That for older Republicans, they remember the Cold War. They remember a time when the American projection of power around the world was this positive thing. And for younger Republicans, they just don't. When I look at polling data on the brand of a country like Israel, it's just hugely different between younger and older Republicans. When I look at polling on whether the U.S. ought to be involved in various things around the world, it's very, very, very different, younger versus older Republicans. And it's not just specific to Gaza or Iran or Ukraine. It's just that I think for younger Republicans, they don't think the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were necessarily a very good idea. They're skeptical of what America is able to do around the world. They'd much rather see those resources at home. And so there are ways in which the young right does have some crossover with the young left, even if in other ways, they are pining for some more traditionalism or something, the stuff that you see online that becomes like the caricature of the young right. I do think that there's if you are a young person who's on the right, you're like really in now. And so my former podcast host, Margie Omeros, used to describe it as like a demi-glace. Like when you like reduce something down, it becomes more intense. And I think you saw that a little bit with young men on the right with those numbers going up. But there's no guarantee that will stick around through 2028 or beyond, because the thing about young people and their political views is that that's when your political views are the most malleable. That's when the most movement is possible. When you are in your early 20s, you are still figuring out what you think about the world. For millennials, they'd gotten to their 40s and they kind of had figured out what they think about the world. And what they think about the world is that like capitalism, meh. So, not really a big fan. And so it's still an open question where Gen Z will land on that, but I suspect that they are not landing in a place where they think anything that's happening right now is what they're looking for.
Yeah, well, in many ways, the story about capitalism versus socialism is more a story of everyone souring on capitalism as opposed to everyone loving socialism. Like, if you look at the polling within the Republican Party, or particularly amongst young Republicans, capitalism has certainly gone south. I mean, socialism has not gone north at all, but I guess that's just how, for at least on the left, like, that's the alternative. If it's not going to be capitalism, then it's going to be socialism. But on the young right, it's like, well, it's probably not capitalism, but we don't quite know what it's going to be instead. I guess it's America first, or sort of however that may take shape.
Which, common good conservatism. There's a couple different names for these concepts.
Which is also not capitalism, right? Like, Donald Trump increasingly taking ownership in public companies and things that I think if anybody on the left ever did them would be reason to sort of tear the walls down. Before I let you go, I do want to ask you about Echelon's new political tribes, because I know the listeners love this kind of stuff. We talked about a Pew political tribes quiz a while back that some of the listeners took. You have a new one with a whole different set of questions that help us better understand how all of this comes together to divide us up. Not divide us as Americans, but sort of categorize us as Americans. It's always fun to find out which type of person you are. I took the quiz, folks. I encourage folks to go take it as well. I'll drop it in the show notes. You can describe what they are, but I'm also curious to hear sort of like how they're evolving or how they're growing, like what it tells us about the future.
We have been doing this political tribes work for the last 2 years, but we've been doing what we call our quadrants analysis for a little bit longer. So what we started off doing was a few years ago, deciding that asking people if they were conservative or liberal or conservative or progressive was not in and of itself that useful. And even if we ask people, are you economically conservative or liberal? Are you socially conservative or liberal? That even then, like, some people would say, oh, I'm socially, moderate to progressive. But actually, they wanted the border secure. They were, pretty tough on crime. They were a little bit, skeptical of some of this new conversation around racial justice. And actually, it turned out that they were more sort of right of center to the versus the median if you actually asked them about views besides just like LGBT issues and abortion. And so we wanted to get a more multifaceted view of people's approaches, because you also had people who said, I'm an economic conservative, but I do think that we should tax the wealthy. And I do think that maybe the government should be more involved in healthcare. And I do think that, and so on and so forth. And you'd find that actually when you ask people their issue positions, it was way more complicated than the labels indicated. So what we then do is we ask people 9 questions about economic issues, 9 questions about social and cultural issues. And then as of late, we've started asking 9 questions about what we call sort of establishmentarian issues. Ooh, did you hear that, Caitlin?
Yeah, I did.
There's thunder happening around me. It is. It's very Shakespearean, dun, 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 the establishmentarian questions. So then we would ask 9 questions about economic issues, 9 questions about social issues, 9 questions about kind of whether you believe institutions can be trusted, the media can be trusted, politicians can be trusted. We moved free trade out of our economic battery and put it there because we found that was more of a proxy for how do you view like the U.S. and the world rather than your commitment to kind of an economically conservative philosophy. And what that led to was what we call 8 different tribes, 4 tribes that lean more rightward, 4 tribes that lean more leftward. And we think it gives a more complex view of what it is that voters really think. Because we have a 2-party system, it can, I think, falsely give the impression that half of America believes one thing, half of America believes the other, when in fact our parties are just what in another system would be coalitions of like 5 different parties all stuck together. And so for us, we believe that the right is made up of the loyal right, your sort of traditional conservatives. This is a group that is staying pretty stable in size. We think there are moderate Republicans who are actually somewhat growing in size, largely because people are becoming a little more economically progressive, and that's sort of tripping them into being part of the moderate right. And then groups that we call middle American optimists and new Republican populists, which are like diametrically opposed but loosely connected pieces of the right. Your new Republican populist is your classic, like, I only really want to vote for Donald Trump. Patrick Ruffini, my business partner, calls them Medicare for all, abortion for none voters. And then middle American optimists are maybe the opposite. Like, they're the closest we have on the right to I like the free market. I actually don't think that income inequality is the biggest problem in the world. And I am somewhat socially more moderate, that group. And they have shrunk as well in the last year in our assessment. On the left, you have the loyal left, which is exactly what you would think the left would look like. They're pretty progressive on everything. What we call electability Democrats, which maybe is your like James Carville, like, look, I'm with you, but you've got to stop being crazy on police, race. There's a couple different issues where these Democrats are like out. They're in on almost all of the economic stuff, but there's some social and cultural issues where they're kind of out. We have American institutionalists, which is a much older, much whiter group. They're actually a little more pro-capitalism. You can see this being like your grandma who likes the bulwark is how I might describe American institutionalists. And then the young and disillusioned, which are, I think people think of those as your like downwardly mobile DSA voting people, but we don't actually find that in our data. We find them to, in some ways, be a little more free market-y, interestingly more pro-Second Amendment than the rest of the left. I think of them maybe as your Joe Rogan type voter who was open to Trump but now has swung. And this is a group that when we look at which groups have moved the most relative to the last couple of years, these, sort of young and disillusioned voters, they were a Democratic-leaning group, but have moved to become like 19 points more Democratic on net, which is one of the biggest movements that we've seen within a tribe in terms of their voting behavior of any of the tribes. So this was a group that they weren't all voting for Trump, but they were like much more open to the idea of Trump, and now are like, no, thank you, I'm out. And they're even more Democratic than those older bulwarky voters in the American institutionalists.
The young and disillusioned. I find that really interesting because that's, again, also people who probably don't pay enough attention to politics or care enough for the political parties to have like A to Z views on something. Like it's your, I don't know, I feel like I talked to, back in the day when I was doing field reporting, like talked to this woman who owned a nail salon who was like, Donald Trump is incredibly racist and like, I can't stand Donald Trump. And also we need lower taxes on small businesses. This is crazy. They're killing us out here. I can't stand New York City government, right? Like it's just people who have, you're like, oh, interesting. Like you kind of would have voted for Mitt Romney, but you also like you've always voted for Democrats or something like that. And then there's also the like, I don't know, maybe the Graham Plattner folks who also really like guns or what have you.
Yeah.
I always find these parts of the political spectrum the most interesting because, after all, what do the political parties' ideological positions, or like what do they all have to do in common anyway? It's interesting when people think for themselves. But, Kristen, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Galen. It was great to be here.
My name is Galen Druk. Remember to become a subscriber to this podcast at gdpolitics.com and wherever you get your podcasts. Paid subscribers get about twice the number of episodes. You can also join in our paid subscriber chat and pass along questions for us to discuss on the show. And you ensure that we can keep making a podcast that prioritizes curiosity, rigor, and a sense of humor. Also, be a friend of the pod and go give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. Maybe even tell a friend about us. Thanks for listening, and we will see you soon.